Hi, Sam.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Not bad. And you?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Samuel Charap, if that's the correct pronunciation.
You got it. Yep.
Close enough. You're at the Rand Corporation. You are, I think, what, a senior political scientist there or something?
That's the silly title they came up with for me. Yeah.
That's a perfectly wonderful. I'd be. You want to trade titles? I like that title. You were also in the State Department during the Obama administration. You recently, like last week, co-authored a piece for Foreign Affairs called "Don't Rule Out Diplomacy in Ukraine." The subtitle, I doubt you gave it the subtitle, but anyway, the subtitle is "Biden's Current Strategy Risks Escalation and Forever War." I want to talk about that. You co-authored that with Miranda. How does she pronounce it? Priebe. You also co-authored a book in 2017 called "Everyone Loses: The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia." I definitely want to draw on that part of your knowledge because I'd like to get into the roots of the conflict a little more deeply than is common. Before we do that, let's talk a little about the foreign affairs piece. And of course, it comes in the aftermath of that famous, maybe infamous letter by 30 progressives in the House trying to push Biden toward some kind of peace initiative. The letter was withdrawn amid blowback the next day. And your view on the letter, I think, is summarized by this part of the piece. It would be premature to push for any particular deal or even for direct negotiations today. But by laying the groundwork for these negotiations, now the U.S., together with its Ukrainian partners and its allies, could minimize the risk of dangerous outcomes and help chart a path toward ending the war. Now, let me try to summarize what I think is the perspective that leads you to think this way, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is you could say going forward, there's kind of three basic kinds of outcomes. On the one hand, Russia could regroup, in the wake of this mobilization they've done, and after the winter, or even during the winter, I guess, start succeeding in pushing the lines westward, maybe considerably. Who knows? They have a big arsenal. In which case, the day might come where Ukraine would say, "I wish we had listened to those 30 progressives," right? I mean, assuming, of course, that a peace deal is gettable, and that assumes things about Russia, but that's an outcome that would be worse than the one we have. Another possibility is Ukraine succeeds in pushing the lines eastward and conceivably starts approaching the stated goal of actually expelling Russian troops, not just from all the ground they've gained since the invasion, but from Crimea, a legacy of the 2014 thing we'll talk about, and the separatist held territory in the Donbass. But as you note, the more you push the lines in that direction, the more you risk a catastrophic outcome because you pose a threat, if not to Russian national security per se, increasingly to the Putin regime, or at least they might perceive it that way. So the more likely they are to lose lots and lots of territory, the more desperate they may become. You could wind up in a nuclear war or with so-called horizontal escalation, a Europe-wide war between NATO and Russia, even if it remained conventional. Okay, so that's the second outcome. That carries considerable risk in your assessment if it goes on long enough. And then the third outcome is not a lot. More or less a stalemate. I mean, lines go back and forth, no big change. And if that happens, then, you're basically getting lots of people killed to not improve the situation. Plus, every day carries the risk of some unforeseen escalation that could lead to a catastrophic outcome. And you're forestalling the day in the future when we might get back to dealing with Russia on areas of common interest like arms control. So is that a fair summary of kind of the way you view the thing? You don't put that explicitly in the piece, but how would you amend that?
So in the piece, we tried to look at the assumptions underlying some of the current thinking about just sort of letting this play out from a Western policy perspective, like, on the assumption that the Ukrainians can keep winning, that they can do so without provoking a catastrophic escalation. And what was my third one? That right. So it was the escalation, and that the costs of and that we won't end up in a protracted conflict. That there'll be a sort of territorial victory will produce some sort of stable outcome at the end of it. And basically, we called into question those. Well, let me put it this way: there are reasons to believe that those three assumptions are not particularly robust, and that things could go differently. As you mentioned, the Russians could start winning on the ground. It's possible. I don't think we should exclude that possibility completely. Escalation remains an ever-present contingency that we need to worry about. And we note that there's no really plausible outcome where Russia stops contesting a status quo territorially that they find to be unacceptable. So you'd really need regime change plus territorial victory to achieve stability at Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, which seems to be the sort of new optimistic scenario outcome. And since regime change really is not the policy of the United States, and I think there's some legitimate concerns about pursuing it, that means that's another recipe for a protracted conflict. So even if Ukraine regains control over all of its sovereign territory, Russia could still violently contest that almost indefinitely. And that's, of course, assuming we get there without escalation. So there are just a lot of ways in which things could go sideways that we need to keep in mind. And therefore, putting in place the architecture for an eventual negotiation seems important. It's also to signal where the U.S. thinks this should go, and according to the president, it should have a negotiated end. So we use Biden's, own op-ed in the New York Times to demonstrate that he's actually on the same page about that. But the question is what you do to bring that about. At the moment, we argue that not much is being done.
And you're not arguing that a ton more can be done, I guess. I mean, what do you argue should be done? More in the way of establishing channels of communication and so on?
So I think we made a few different ones. One is the way the narrative is publicly discussed. At the moment, the emphasis is on helping the Ukrainians for as long as it takes, not that the war will only definitively end in diplomacy. And those are both quotes from Biden. And those two things are not mutually contradictory. The second is about sort of socializing the idea that this is what, in fact, the objective of the United States and with its allies and with the Ukrainians. So keeping everyone on the same page is important, because if there seems to be some divergence from that emerging, because it's not really the first item on the agenda in any meeting right now. And then, yes, also having more channels that are active with the Russians, so that when the parties are ready, we're in a position to act. It's not about like calling a great peace conference tomorrow. It's about sort of having the architecture and the sort of political space to do it when the battlefield conditions, or at least the battlefield conditions, create political conditions that are conducive to it among the two parties. I mean, the thing is, it is true that the Ukrainians not only get a vote here, but they're the ones fighting and dying. It is the talking point about it not being for us to decide is both not only sort of morally justified, but factually, even though the U.S. does have a lot of influence. So if the Ukrainians are winning right now, they're retaking territory. And by as long as that can continue without creating significant escalatory risks, then I see the argument for letting it continue. But the question is, what happens after that? If we're adopting a public posture that suggests, particularly to the Russians, that we will only accept their unconditional surrender in a sort of Versailles 2.0 kind of outcome, then they don't have any incentive to demonstrate interest in compromise either. So yeah, it's about sort of how you position yourself, the U.S. positions itself to be ready for the moment when negotiations might be pursued.
Is it even easy to imagine what those would look like in terms of battlefield conditions? I mean, as of now, Putin hasn't even achieved really the objectives implicit in his original pre-invasion speech. In other words, you kind of imagined he was going to, at a minimum, secure Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. He hasn't fully done that. Now he's said he's annexing those and two others, although there has been a kind of signaling of flexibility on the final borders of the other two from the Russian side. But it's part of the problem that we're a ways from a place where you think Putin himself as a political matter could settle for a settlement. I mean, leaving aside the fact that if you left Russian troops where they are, that's so far from what Ukraine is envisioning and from what may be politically acceptable to them. Leave that aside. But where would Putin have to be before you could talk peace?
So talking is something we should be doing while we're fighting and not envisioning an immediate settlement. I think that one of the problems has been that from the beginning, we haven't, sort of negotiations have been viewed as a concession, which I think has been a mistake. You engage in communication with adversaries to make sure that your positions are known, to look for possible, daylight in theirs. This is not about accepting their position. It's just a means of pursuing your national interests. And I think that has been, understandably politically, but I think from a policy perspective, something of a shortcoming that the communication channels. And, to be fair to both the U.S. government and European allies, that talking to the Russians is extremely frustrating right now, particularly from any number of different reasons, but now mostly because of the, unbelievable degree of personalization of the regime in Russia. So talking to anyone but Putin is, to a certain extent, of minimal utility. But all that being said, you need to keep the channels open, and I think it was a mistake to have closed them when they were closed. So there are two ways of answering the question about what the kind of battlefield conditions might look like. You could make a case that so it seems like the Russians are retreating across the Dnipro River in Kherson province right now.
Does it seem like that to you? It seems ambiguous to me.
Yeah, well, so you need to retreating is harder than attacking militarily, and often you need to build up in order to retreat.
So that's what you think is happening. Okay.
That is okay. Let me put it this way. I think that there's that's a plausible explanation for what's going on.
Okay, so go ahead. Sorry,
certainly we've seen a lot of traffic going east across the river on their improvised bridges. So let's assume that's true. Then you've got a sort of natural boundary in the south that Ukrainians are going to have a hard time crossing. If the part of the northern part of that line in the south holds in Zaporizhia, you could sort of see a line emerging, particularly if the winter essentially inhibits further forward movement. Now, things are dynamic a little bit.
We should just say, for people who aren't focused on the maps, that is kind of what connects Kherson, Zaporizhia connects Kherson to the Donbass, to Donetsk and Luhansk. It's part of the so-called land bridge from Crimea, right? And those are the four provinces Putin has said he's annexed.
Right, without actually controlling any of them in full. So the Ukrainians are making some headway in Luhansk. The Russians are making some headway in Donetsk, but none of this is like of strategic significance. They're not dramatic moves forward one way or another. But that could change, as we've seen. A lot of this has been somewhat unpredictable. I think the river is sort of a natural boundary in the south. But in any case, I could draw you a picture about how the winter freezes these lines, and then you sort of get to the natural stalemate that way. but equally, it could go the other way, and there could be a lot of dynamic movement, and Russia could rely on these sort of frontline related assaults on Ukraine, all this sort of attacks on the critical infrastructure throughout the winter. The winter is not going to stop that. In fact, it'll make it more painful because of the need to heat houses and so on. There's that. But I do think that more broadly, we're not going to really know about the negotiating space until there's a table and people are sitting at it.
Right.
Putin actually said yesterday, interestingly, because somebody asked precisely the question that, or a version of the question that you asked, which is like, okay, so there's no overlap between our Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions. Well, what possible reason is there to negotiate? And he said, well, you don't show your willingness to compromise before the negotiation starts. You start out with what they, sort of.
Wait, Putin said that?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Let me ask you, do you think that the Biden administration has a clear end game in mind, something they're trying to steer this toward? And if so, what is it? It's not clear to me. Because, nominally they are embracing the kind of maximalist objectives of pushing Russia back to the, I guess, pre-2014 borders.
Well, it depends on. So I think there are a few ways of answering that question, none of which I find fully satisfactory. But so on the one hand, they would say that the exact line is for the Ukrainians to decide. It's not for us to decide, which is fair. But
it's fair, but it's inconsistent with the entire history of actual politics, right? I mean, traditionally, when a huge country is providing critical support, without which what they call the client state in technical terms, without which that state would collapse, the big state does apply leverage, right? I mean, that it would be an aberration if that didn't happen in this case, right?
There's a lot of examples of client states wagging their patron dogs that have in recent years.
I can think of some in current American international relations, in fact, but you know what I mean. I mean, it's yeah. Go ahead.
Well, let me just sort of agree, but things go both ways. There are cases when leverage like that is exerted, and there are cases when the client or the smaller partner is able to get what it wants from the bigger state without having to compromise. So I wouldn't exclude it going either way in this case. But your question was about like desired outcomes. So there was that op-ed in at the end of May where, quoting Zelensky, Biden said this will end in negotiations. So it's not every day that the president writes an op-ed laying out U.S. objectives, and that was that has not been abandoned in theory. On the other hand, there's this G7 statement from right after the strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure started, which is pretty maximalist, to use your word, in talking about full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, reparations, justice for war crimes, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that there's a little bit of those things perhaps are mutually contradictory, because by definition, we're not going to get everything we want from a negotiation. That's how negotiations work. I think there, if pushed, they would say this war will only definitively end with negotiations. Ukrainians get to decide, when they're ready for that. I think the concern is mostly not with where that line is, but how to avoid escalatory, dynamics in the interim. That the most important thing is avoiding this either vertically escalating to nuclear use or horizontally escalating to a war with NATO. I think a lot of effort is devoted to that, while of course, perhaps even more effort is devoting to assisting the Ukrainians. So I'm not fully satisfied with all that, but if you want, I think that's probably the best I can do in terms of presenting it. Yeah.
Let me try out a weird theory that popped into my head the other day in terms of what the administration may be aiming for. And it has to do with two problems the administration faces, I'd say. First of all, at this point, any realistic peace deal, if there is such a thing, would leave Russia with positive reinforcement for having invaded a sovereign country. That's like a bad thing for the world. Not that, well, don't get me started, but not that we haven't done the same thing and been, not that we have not invaded sovereign countries, but
haven't generally annexed their territories, at least not in the last 100 years.
We have not annexed them. I would say Kosovo is an example of borders changing, or at least us trying to change borders as a result of an arguably illegal in international law assault on a sovereign country. I don't know how strongly you differ with that, but you could make that case, right?
Sure, but Kosovo is not the 51st state, right? Like it's that's
no. I admit we have not annexed. We have not annexed territory, but it's commonly said that it would be unprecedented in the post-Cold War era for borders to be changed in Europe, but through forceful and that's a little misleading. But I don't want. I
agree.
Yeah.
But already it happened in 2014, by the way.
with Russia,
yeah. Crimea,
yeah. So anyway, there is a valid concern of giving positive reinforcement to Russia for invasion. There is separately a political problem for Biden of just looking like he lost, which is correlated with the other problem. Because if Russia's hanging on to a lot of territory, people will say you lost. And what occurred to me is that maybe they're thinking about regime change as a kind of solution to both problems, and it would be a different framing of regime change. I mean, normally regime change advocates have this idea that, well, it'll go pretty smoothly, and the successor regime will be better by our lights. Well, maybe they're not assuming that. They're just thinking that, well, if Putin is deposed, it'll look like he lost as a result of invading. So it will not be such an important precedent for other leaders. And B, Biden can say, hey, I won. I'm still standing. I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but let's face it, there are political considerations here. And Biden doesn't want to, American presidents never like to allow the opposing party to say they lost a war. So in that scenario, that's why they're playing for time. In other words, they want to make life more and more uncomfortable for Putin, hoping they'll get a regime change that takes the sting out of a peace settlement on both of those fronts. Does that seem crazy?
I don't think that, while it's hard not, given what he's done, to wish that Putin were not in charge. I do not think that is the objective of U.S. policy. And, they've stated as much, but I also happen to think it's true that it's not the objective of U.S. policy. I think there are so many wild cards that a regime change in Russia could introduce. Things could get worse as a result. That people are, and there's also no sign that it's in the offing. So it's not, and it's generally not within our power to produce. So I don't see that as where they're heading. One thing I would say about loss and victory, though, I think there's a framing problem here because, in my view, and I think this could be made into a sort of public narrative, Russia has already lost, no matter where the line is. Like Russia's strategic defeat, as I think the term is often tossed around by U.S. officials, is already a thing. Like that's done. And no matter how much territory Russia takes control over, because of the astonishing damage to A, their military capabilities, B, their international reputation, C, their economy, their capacity to rearm. I mean, Russia is going to has weakened itself, in the last 9 months more than any U.S. policy or any other, could have done. So I think if we remain, if the narrative were focused on that as the sort of like we already won, and I think that's true, if you're looking at it in the sort of strategic rivalry context, and the rest is details, then that would be probably a better framing politically. Um, there's the politics of the power of Zelensky's communication skills have made doing something against his will quite difficult, right? And so you'd really need him on board for any change, and I think that's going to be a major challenge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Final question on this front before we go to 2014. I guess one thing that worries me in that context is that, I think your view, as I understand it, is that Putin got into this war largely out of the kind of national security considerations that so-called realists leave aside an exegesis on that term. So-called realists emphasize, and that for that reason, perhaps if we had been more attentive to what Russia saw as its critical interests, a lot of this maybe could have been avoided. But, as things unfold, in terms of, going way back in American policy, but certainly up to maybe, a month or so before the invasion, leave that aside, things change. And I worry that increasingly Putin, he's aware, I'm sure, of what you're saying, that this is, that in many ways Russia has lost, and that he increasingly sees this as a kind of a legacy issue, right? Like, and that's just a different set of incentives on his part. It's like, maybe he's decided that whatever happens when I'm dead, they're going to say Russia has these 4 provinces. This is sheer conjecture, but do you? Let me just ask you, as a kind of somebody with some sympathy for the realist perspective, which is probably associated with Rand generally, historically, to some extent. Do you think about these things? How is Putin's psychology changes? To what extent are things other than national security interests and even domestic political interests per se shaping his perspective?
So I'll just couple of health warnings, as they say. I don't accept the realist label on myself.
Right. Right.
And there are many my colleagues have tons of different views on this set of issues. We certainly don't have a single organization view, and nor do we really take organizational views on anything, except objectivity of research. But to your question, I think that it is plausible that so none of us are inside of Putin's head, but it certainly is plausible that there are other factors going on here besides just pure national security ones, be they legacy, a sort of cultural pseudo-imperialistic view of Russia and Ukraine as one people, and this idea of Ukraine as an artificial state. I think that it's hard after Putin's article in April of last year, where he sort of laid out this historically grounded view of how Ukraine doesn't really exist, or can only exist, or can only be secure with close relations with Russia. It's kind of hard to say that, like, there aren't other ideas driving him. I think the question now is less about what drove him to begin with, or even what his maximalist fantasies are about what Russia's position in Ukraine should be. Because reality has demonstrated that he cannot achieve that. So he might harbor these sort of fantasies about even just territorial control that are not realizable with the capabilities that Russia has brought to bear in this context. And that cold hard reality is kind of, I think, more relevant than his fevered dreams about
Okay.
cultural oneness with the Ukrainian people and so on. So I think that that's one point. And another is that when we, I think we risk absolutizing things like national security concerns in decision making, saying, okay, well, he has these concerns, he did this thing, therefore, the concerns drove this thing. At every point, right? He in a personalistic autocracy system, but more broadly, Russia, the Russian leadership has agency in how they decide to handle problems, right? Like, so you could say, okay, prospect of NATO enlargement was a security concern for Russia. They could deal with it in any number of different ways, right? And that he chose this way, I think, ultimately does. Russia has agency in that decision he did, and he bears responsibility for it.
Sure. And he's the one who violated international law by invading and all that. At the same time, this is by way of transition to talking about 2014, when given what you know about A, who is in fact the leader of Russia, and B, just kind of the range of tendencies you generally see in leaders of superpowers, maybe particularly declining superpowers, I don't know. But in any event, just given what you can kind of guess about the range of possible likely behaviors exhibited by a leader, it's possible that we should have done a number of things differently along the way to reduce the probability of something like this happening. Is that fair to say?
I would agree with that statement.
Okay, so let's talk about, and of course, some people would take this all the way back to the 90s, the beginning of NATO expansion. A lot of foreign policy eminences in the U.S. warned that that was a bad idea. George Kennan even said, look, something bad's going to happen and people are going to say, this is the way Russia is. But no, we helped create the conditions. But anyway, let's, and then of course in 2008, Bush specifically pledged future membership to Ukraine and Georgia. But let's big threshold there, but let's jump to 2014. And let me give you my understanding, which is very limited, of what happened, and you can kind of correct me and tell me what other things you think are relevant. So, the Russian president, the Ukrainian president, who was, remind me, what's
Viktor Yanukovych.
Yanukovych, okay. Ukraine was contemplating moving toward the European Union with a so-called, I guess, associate membership or something. And that was the plan.
Association agreement, yeah.
Association agreement. That was the plan. Putin was lobbying heavily against this. Now, the first question I have is, I remember hearing Stephen Cohen on the radio at that point, the late Russian expert Steve Cohen, saying at that point that we need more creative diplomacy from the EU because they're basically, membership in the EU means a severing of various kinds of economic relations or beneficial relations between Ukraine and Russia. And, given the sensibilities here, we need a more creative solution. There needs to be some kind of special accommodation. Let me just ask you, does that make sense? Was that a case where there should have been more creativity that wouldn't have precluded association with the EU, but would have, I don't want to put words in his mouth. I don't know what exactly he was proposing, but were you at that point thinking maybe this is too dichotomous a way of framing the issue, or what?
So by that point, it was too late, of course. But the framework of the association agreement, which sounds, harmless, is sort of by definition does limit Ukraine's ability to, economically integrate with Russia or any other state. So basically what the association agreement at its core was about was incorporating large parts of the acquis communautaire, the EU's body of laws and regulations, into Ukrainian law. So it was an approximation of what it meant to be a member of the EU without a membership perspective at the time. And that meant that you essentially lost sovereign control, or you gave sovereign control over your tariffs and your trade policy to Brussels, because that future, they were also obliged to adopt future changes. So
including sanctions against Russia in principle, presumably. If that happened in the future, Ukraine would be joining in. But that's just an asterisk.
Yeah, I'm not quite. I imagine that's true, but I think on trade issues it was the most important piece, and that.
Yeah.
So, and this had to do with basically the way that the EU decided to offer a framework for interaction with the current countries of the so-called Eastern Partnership, which included Ukraine and Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. That it was kind of like the membership process, where basically countries that want to become members of the EU have to adopt all of the EU rules. But here it was like that, but without the prospect of becoming a member and without the structural funds that came along with it. So, but that is very much a, so EU, that was what was offered Ukraine, and Ukraine willingly entered into that, set of arrangements. And that did, in fact, limit the extent to which it could have deeper economic integration with Russia. And over time, it would have redirected trade. There's no question, because that's what happens when you sort of join the EU's sort of economic legal space, that it becomes much easier to trade with EU members, because you have to adopt all their standards. You have to, you don't face tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's a bigger market than Russia. It was, in my view, that model of a key communautaire adoption, not to get too far in the weeds, was not the right one for for the framework for the EU policy towards its neighbors there. Of course, it's not for me to say. I'm not an EU citizen. But anyway, and that did create this sort of black and white situation where Russia was trying to pursue its own economic integration initiatives that would have been incompatible with signing the association agreement. And so Ukraine had this stark choice to face, either one or the other. And Putin did, in fact, put the screws on for Yanukovych to at least reject one, if not choose the other. There's some ambiguity as to what the demands were. But
yeah. So Yanukovych did have a change of heart in accordance with Putin's wishes. And I mean, ostensibly, he could argue in terms of Ukrainian national interests that Putin was offering a lot of like subsidies or something. I mean, there were real economic benefits that Russia was offering Ukraine, and superficially, at least, that's what happened. I don't know if stuff was going on under the table or threats were made or what. You said Putin put the screws on. How much do we know beyond that? He rewarded Ukraine with subsidies for for Yanukovych's change of heart.
They basically shut down bilateral trade for 2 days, imposing all these ridiculous restrictions on it as a sort of warning shot in the month or two before the agreement with the EU was signed, basically saying this is, you will face a totally different trading environment with Russia if you follow through on this. So there were sticks and carrots. There's no question. But the sticks were definitely brandished. And so Yanukovych would have faced significant economic disruption had he gone through with the EU deal, because Russia was, basically threatening that.
And in Putin's mind, presumably, the EU thing is just kind of intertwined with the NATO thing to some extent. I mean, there are purely economic considerations, but I think he sees the whole thing as the West trying to lure Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence in a kind of unified way or something, right?
Yes, but I think we don't. That therefore doesn't bring us to the annexation of Crimea. What happened in the interim is the key variable, right?
Right.
That there was this revolution. Sorry, go ahead.
So let's talk about that and the way Putin may see it, which is important in its own right, as well as is the objective truth about whatever happened. But so after Yanukovych's change of heart, there were protests by people who wanted to join the EU. Things, well, I'm skipping a lot, but things eventually got violent. there are different stories on the two sides as to who started the violence, who's most responsible for the violence. But in any event, Yanukovych did flee the country, presumably for fear of his life. I mean, there were, I think, at that point, armed opponents roaming the street, and things were getting kind of out of control. So you could say he was deposed in a violent revolution. People who are particularly skeptical of the Western role call it a coup, but leave that aside. The point is he kind of fled for fear of his life. I think so far these are actual facts, right? As for Putin's apprehension of the situation, he would point. I think he seems to view it, and it wouldn't shock me if he actually does, as the whole thing is being kind of orchestrated by the West. And of course, there is the famous phone call that Russia presumably taped, where Victoria Nuland of the State Department is talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and they're basically saying, well, here's who we want to be, in power after whatever. And the person wound up being in power and so on. There's also the fact that if you look at the kind of what energized the protests, you can point to these organizations that were funded by National Endowment of Democracy, some even by the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, I think, that we would think of as, civil society. It's all good. Putin would think of as you're trying to inject Western influence into Ukraine and so on. As a result, he thinks of this as I think genuinely as to some extent, Western orchestrated thing. And once it's happened, there are initial signs of that would not be welcomed by so-called ethnic Russians in Ukraine, whatever those are. But people in the east and southeast, the parliament did some initiative about lowering the stature of the Russian language and so on. There was that. From Putin's point of view, pretty clearly, his mind turned to Crimea before long, where Russia had this very important naval base that had been leased technically from Ukraine since the breakup of the Soviet Union. That may have figured in his decision to invade Crimea, whatever. Let me stop there and ask you what you would add or subtract from that narrative.
So the U.S. sponsored organizations, I mean, the NDI, IRI, et cetera, their really involvement in this protest movement was quite, there wasn't much of it at all, I think. And it was very spontaneous and, sort of organic. And it was as much about Yanukovych's authoritarian, corrupt rule as it was about EU membership or anything like that. That's one thing. So I would not, whatever Putin saw, it's important to note that this was really quite a domestically driven dynamic, even including the violent parts. But what I would note are two things. One that we're missing from that. One is that there was an agreement a couple days before Yanukovych fled that the Russians still talk about. It's kind of funny. That was Russia blessed, and that European foreign ministers were involved in negotiating that would have sort of allowed for a pacted transition. There would be new elections. Basically Yanukovych would be would leave power, but through a new elections, and the opposition would sort of sign on to this. And basically the day after, the government sort of collapsed in the literal sense, like there was a power vacuum, and so that the document itself was sort of OBE by the time it was even signed. But that was one moment where I think that the Russians thought that there was going to, okay, so West has their people, we have ours, and we're going to have at least a sort of transition here that's orderly. And then that sort of goes out the window, not the doing of Western policy at all, more a function of what's going on the ground. And then what happens in terms of the nature of the transition after Yanukovych departs is that a government that was dominated by people from the Donbass, essentially, and other eastern regions of the country shifted and was by Ukrainian standards, relatively Russia-friendly. It's not exactly pro-Russian isn't the right term, because Yanukovych was difficult for the Russians to deal with too. And as you note, he was pursuing this agreement with the EU until Putin put the screws on him to stop. But the shift was to a government that was dominated by people from the west of the country who had a very, sort of anti-Russian leanings, and they came to power as a result of a revolution that had a violent sort of vanguard that was a nationalist, far-right, anti-Russian, sort of part of a broader, a non-violent movement. But nonetheless, that part was there.
So you're saying the violent vanguard was far-right,
had far-right nationalist elements,
and historically connection to neo-Nazis?
I mean, we could make more of that. Sure, but parts of it did. There was a portrait of the famous Ukrainian nationalist who did collaborate with the Nazis.
Bandera.
On the Maidan while all this was happening. In fact, it was there still in July 2014 when I visited after that point. But the majority of the Ukrainians on the square and protesting throughout the country, that was not what they were driven by, but there was the people who were most motivated and that had weapons were. I mean, it all seems like ancient history now compared to where we are today. But in any case, I think what Russia saw there was a sort of, having their position in Ukraine being completely shattered overnight.
Right.
And so the revolution, I think, is really the trigger for what comes afterwards. And what the kind of government it brought to power. So basically, Russia saw itself losing everything, Crimea included. And
in effect, in other words, it feared that the naval base could be in jeopardy, or I mean, it hadn't had Crimea before. It didn't literally lose it, but there was a fear
losing the base. Yes.
Right. So let me just quickly interject one thing. In terms of, I don't doubt that you're right that there was a lot of kind of indigenous grassroots support. I was watching a documentary about the Maidan Revolution, and there was this one guy that they said played a big role. He became a big figure and played a big role in generating enthusiasm for the protests. He was associated with some media outlet. I looked it up online, and in Wikipedia, it said that it had gotten some funding from the U.S. embassy in Ukraine or something. And I don't think that necessarily matters much, except that given what we know about human nature, it's the kind of thing a Putin would seize on, right? I mean, we all have confirmation bias. I just, in terms of imagining his psychology, that's the kind of thing he's focusing on, right? Like he's connecting.
I think what mattered to him,
connect. What's that?
Much more. What mattered to him much more was the outcome of the revolution, which was that, like, basically, Russia went from accepting a sort of partial loss of influence with this agreement on February 21st to on February 23rd, basically having, the prospect of, as they saw it, losing everything.
So do you think then that the framing that Putin seems to be having some success with domestically, as far as I can tell, which is that this is now Russia against the West. It's existential. It's NATO. It's the EU. It's woke people. This is existential. Do you think that's like largely a cynical construct on his part? Or, what I was suggesting with that one little data point that I thought he might connect into a larger kind of conspiratorial picture is that to some extent it's the way he actually views the thing as a struggle with the West. But
so I think he does see popular uprisings as generally not spontaneous, that there tend to be external sponsors, that these are sort of color revolutions. It's a tool of U.S. foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's broadly true. The framing of the conflict as being with the West, which has been there since February 2014, that does resonate. The extent to which it resonates, it can be debated, because if you look at the numbers tend to, in terms of Russian views of who's their main enemy and so on, or like, how do they assess relations with a given Western country? I mean, they fluctuate a lot. which sort of suggests that they're not particularly deeply held and depend a lot on the political context and so on. So, but now we're in a totally different world where Russians are being told that their boys and husbands are being killed by, Western proxies. So who knows what kind of views are going to emerge from all of this? But
Okay. And then, of course, Putin also, to the extent to which he sponsored and initiated the separatist uprising in the Donbass is argued about, but he clearly played a role and was willing to see how far it could succeed, and was willing to support it. And then it didn't succeed all that broadly, at least immediately in a military sense. Relatively slender sliver of the Donbass was carved out by the separatists. Now, at that point, there was this Minsk II agreement that everyone signed on to: U.S., Ukraine, Russia, Europeans. Ukraine did not wind up implementing it, right? I think it's fair to say that they're the ones who, in the end, did not support it in ways that mattered, did not actually kind of ratify it or something. And I gather that would have, in effect, given the Donetsk and Luhansk a kind of veto power over anything like a decision to join NATO. So it would have solved the NATO problem. And is that all right? Is that correct? What I've said, more or less, that, because this is the thing that was revived on the eve of the invasion and periodically before then, is saying, like, wait, this is our last chance. I mean, we could really try to do this Minsk II thing, which of course would seem to leave Ukraine in a much better position than I think what you see as the realistic outcomes of the war at this point. But what's your line on Minsk, the Minsk deal?
So first of all, the U.S. wasn't involved in negotiating it. It was the Germans and the French, together with the Ukrainians and the Russians, which I think becomes kind of important later on, because the U.S. never really owned it or took responsibility for it in a way.
Did we sign anything?
No.
We sign it? No, we didn't sign a document
at all. Yeah.
Okay.
We've expressed support for it. Nominally, some sanctions are linked to Russia's implementation of it, but the U.S. was not involved. And that was, at the time, a deliberate decision, or at Merkel's request, I think, from what I understand. Obama let the Europeans take the lead. But neither side ended up implementing the provisions completely. But it is true that it was a victor's peace. Russia just sort of crushed the Ukrainians on the battlefield, and the political deal was seen as not at all, desirable from the Ukrainian perspective. Understandably so, because they were forced to sign it at a barrel of a gun. I think the question becomes, would we be in a better world with a bad Minsk II implemented, and thus the sort of threat of war potentially decreased, or what we have now? And what we have now is a horrible, horrible tragedy, to say nothing of the just from a humanitarian perspective, the lives lost and the destruction and the global economic disruption, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I wrote a piece in November of last year. I can't believe it's probably almost a year ago now, saying, okay, well, it seems like we might have a war. And if the alternative is implementing this bad Minsk deal, which, no question is bad, maybe we should try to pursue that, because a war would be really horrible. And not to say that that necessarily was the cure, but it certainly is a plausible, historical counterfactual, so to speak, that it might have prevented all this from happening. But I think, and this is the key linkage between 2014 and what happened between 2014 and 2022 and now, which is that basically there was no sense of urgency in Washington or other Western capitals about moving ahead on this arrangement, that it was sort of seen as an acceptable kind of messy interim status quo, yes, we'd call for Russia to implement Minsk II and, ceasefire and withdraw and blah, blah, blah. But like there was no seriousness of purpose about actually making implementation a real thing. It's sort of conflict had died down to a level where it was sort of manageable and so on. And I think that was the key oversight that, those of us who were looking at this perhaps more closely would say that like it was never going to be just okay for Russia to watch Ukraine, integrate into NATO and lose all of its influence there, and just to sort of sit there in the Donbass and support a tiny little separatist enclave indefinitely. That something was going to have to give at some point.
And then we started sending arms into Ukraine, and did that further raise the chances of trouble? It was meant as a deterrent, of course.
Sure. I mean, I hesitate to assign agency to those kinds of decisions, but you could see
how about causal significance?
Well, okay. Well, I don't know about causal significance even. I think that the what is true is that like Russia saw its near nightmare scenario materializing, that there was going to be a sort of Ukraine where it had no levers of influence. Zelensky sort of locked up Putin's, or put under house arrest, his major proxy in Ukrainian politics. That Zelensky, a Russian speaker from the East who came to power on a platform of peace, couldn't deliver on Minsk II from Russia's perspective. So you had, and then, Ukraine increasingly being procuring and being supplied weapons from not only the United States, but the UK, Turkey, with these armed drones and so on. So you could see how, from Russia's perspective, this might be a sort of window of opportunity that's closing, that leads to states taking decisions that are, that might not be the most well calculated. So, like if the anti-tank javelins hadn't been given to the Ukrainians, would there not have been a war? Well, there might still have been a war. So I hesitate to. It's a bigger picture. They fit into a bigger picture. It's not just one thing. It rarely is, but I think, it's sort of about where the trend lines were heading more broadly, and they weren't going in a direction that Russia could live with, or at least the current Russian leadership.
Okay. Do you have time for one more question? I know you need.
Sure.
So it's about the lay of, it's kind of the demographic map of Ukraine. There was certainly a time when there was, if you just look at a map of the election outcomes, there was a time when there was a big split politically between West and East. And you could say that the East was in some sense maybe more pro-Russian or more skeptical of policies favored in the West or something. Presumably you would say there was some degree of indigenous sentiment in support of the separatist movement, leaving aside the question of how exactly dependent it was for success on Russian support. And I've never been able to figure out kind of how meaningful that is at this point. Let me put it another way. I mean, in the Western media, it is sometimes presented as if every town in Ukraine is completely full of people who want to be liberated by Ukraine and have no time for the Russians. And I've always thought, well, it must be a little more complicated than that. And some of these towns, I'm wondering, are they divided in sentiment? And of course, this is presumably changed over time because, for example, Kharkiv was a time where at one point you might have thought there was a lot of pro-Russian sentiment. On the other hand, once the Russians invade and start shelling the city, opinions will change. And of course, this matters going forward because it affects things like how easy will it be for Ukraine to seize certain cities and maintain them without having to play like real hardball, and so too for Russia. Like what cities does it have an easier time holding than other cities? And of course, in addition to changes of sentiment, you've had actual migration. I presume that when the Russians come and take a town, most of the people who leave were anti-Russian, and that changes the demographic right there. So, for example, in Kherson, Russia may have a friendlier population than it had before the war. I don't know, and I've seen basically no good reporting on this. Do you have anything to say to help us figure this out? It seems complicated.
Yes, and the Ukrainian public opinion and divides within it are not neatly, they don't neatly fit on ethnic categories, and even linguistic preferences. You can have, very anti-Russian Russian speakers who identify as ethnic Ukrainian. I mean, there's lots of the lines are never clear. I mean, I'll just give you one example, like there's this town in Zaporizhia, Melitopol, which was one of the first major towns that the Russians seized. The mayor, who was detained and then exchanged in a prisoner swap back into Ukrainian-controlled areas, became something of a celebrity for a little bit. I think there was a New Yorker piece that featured him. His name was Ivan Fyodorov, which is just about as Russian a name as you can get. And ethnically so, but his sort of collaborationist successor, the sort of that Russian appointed woman, his last name is Danilchenko, which again is a Ukrainian, so things are quite complicated, and it's never as straightforward as either ethnic or linguistic preferences or self-identification. What I would say is that we don't have any real data since the war began to go on to make judgments about this. We have, though, anecdotal reporting, which even in Western newspapers has, caught my eye. For example, I believe it was in the Telegraph. It was a British paper where they were going around with Ukrainian units that were retaking towns in Kharkiv, who were saying to the reporter that basically, it's 50-50 in these places as to whether the people here want to see us or not, are happy to see us or not. Then there was an interesting Times story again about an embedded reporter who was with the Ukrainian unit when they came upon like an old man in the woods somewhere in, again, I think this was also Kharkiv region. And they were immediately suspicious of his political loyalties and whether he had been there spotting for the Russians or so on. And, he claimed he was just walking through the woods. So these kinds of things are, I think, playing out, and it's not entirely clear. Obviously, Russia has done a lot to eliminate any possible warm feelings that people have towards Russia in the country by bombing it all the time, and war crimes. All of this stuff is just there has been a caesura among the vast majority of Ukrainians. I think that's fair to say. But in the separatist held regions that have been held since 2014, particularly in Crimea, in areas of the south that Russia has held on to, there's probably some degree of ambivalence. I think a lot of people are probably just want, the war to stop. But again, this is conjecture because sociology in wartime, generally speaking, is pretty unreliable, and it's impossible to even conduct there. So we all only have this sort of anecdotal reporting. But the anecdotal reporting is consistent with what we knew before, which is that in the east of the country, it's just a complicated story. And the contestation over Ukrainian national identity, which was before the war, before 2014, it was much more of a real thing, and even before 2022. I mean, now the erasure of everything Russian from Ukraine is sort of state policy and has not met much resistance. So
in
even
terms of like what language in schools,
literature, monuments. So like Bulgakov statues in Ukraine, in Kiev, where he wrote some of his most famous novels and where some of his most famous novels took place, have been removed. Pushkin Street has been renamed. This kind of thing.
Is this mainly since the invasion?
A lot of it since the invasion. There was decommunization after 2014, where a lot of the sort of Soviet era names were, and some Tsarist era names were removed from towns and streets and so on. But the sort of full on, Russian is the language of our sort of imperialist oppressors, and therefore we must resist it. So it's quite widespread.
There was some anti-Russian language legislation or policy before the invasion, right? I mean, Putin made a big deal of it. I don't think
the irony, of course, is that it never went into effect.
Right.
But it was it was sort of passed by Parliament, but then tabled by the acting president at the time in 2014. But it's certainly an effort to make Ukrainian it's the state language and so on. But there was de facto bilingualism in Ukraine, particularly before 2014, but even before 2022. I think, I haven't been back since the war started, but from what I understand, it's just not as acceptable to be
to speak Russian publicly.
Well, that's probably an exaggeration, because of course, now there are a lot of Russian exiles there who speak Russian publicly, and there was even a Russian language version of their, there's only one TV channel essentially in Ukraine since the war started. But
right.
So it's complicated. There has been a sort of backlash against Russian language for sure, and Russian culture, which is, frankly, perfectly understandable under the circumstances. It's just, I think that it's a question about how much the war will, forge a sense of nationhood, which actually wars have historically done,
right.
Or whether there will, the division lines that existed before will persist in some perhaps lessened form. Obviously, the population displacement will play a major role here too.
Okay. I don't suppose there any a note of hope you can leave us on, is there?
Note of hope.
You can just say no.
It's pretty bleak at the moment. Maybe next, if there is a note of hope, I'll get back to you.
Will you? Will you drop me a line?
Okay, will do.
Okay, well, listen, thank you so much. Your piece in Foreign Affairs is called "Don't Rule Out Diplomacy in Ukraine." Your book is called "Everyone Loses." I like the recognition there that this is a non-zero-sum game. Not everyone shares that apprehension. Who has influence on American foreign policy? Thanks so much, Sam.
My pleasure. Thanks.